This is not directed at all atheists, but many have an odd confusion about the evidence for God. Many atheists insist that God's existence must be empirical or scientifically proven. Otherwise, there is no reason to believe a designer exists. The assumption here is that the only reason we should believe something is true is if there is scientific proof for it. But this line of reasoning is not how we operate in several subjects. There are many things we accept as true that cannot be scientifically verified. See, science works through inductive methods. We do an experiment 100 times, and if we get the exact same result every time, we conclude that it is scientifically proven and that we will continue to get the same result. However, for many subjects, we cannot use this same method to reach a conclusion. Dr. John Lennox explains by looking at forensics. If we stumble across a crime scene and find a person dead, we cannot say, "Well, I don't know, let's run the experiment again and see what happened." Such a method would be absurd in figuring out who the murderer is. Instead, we have to deduce a conclusion from the evidence left at the scene. We have to evaluate what has been left behind and reach a logical inference. So in other words, we have to apply the methodology that is appropriate to the claim. So when we look at subjects like history, forensics, or philosophy, we cannot run experiments or take scientific measurements to determine a conclusion. Instead, we have to evaluate evidence and deduce an inference, which is why the question, "Does God exist?" is not a scientific one. We cannot run an experiment to determine if he exists, any more than we can run an experiment to determine who committed a murder, or where did the first humans originate, or if two people are in love. In some instances, we can do experiments on the evidence we have, but we cannot replay an event or take measurements. We have to apply the proper method for reaching a conclusion for the claim. So when we start looking for answers to specific things that are, by definition, outside the natural world, we obviously cannot do a scientific experiment. That is like saying, "Show me the empirical proof in space-time for something that exists outside of space-time." It is simply nonsense. C.S. Lewis taught that would be like Hamlet going into the castle attic to look for Shakespeare. Thomas Nagel says, if God exists, he is not part of the natural order, but a free agent not governed by natural laws. He may act partly by creating a natural order, but whatever he does directly cannot be part of that order. So to find answers for things that are outside the natural world, we can only study the evidence left in the natural world and reach the most rational inference as to why certain things are the way they are. This is what the aim of natural theology is. It is not attempting to prove a designer exists, like one proves a scientific fact through measurement or observation. Rather, these philosophical arguments take the evidence we can evaluate and reach the most rational inference to explain things where science cannot go, because a logical mind seeks the most rational inference to the evidence. Science is great for explaining things within nature, within space-time, and we should keep studying science to form a better view about the natural world. Only an irrational person would suggest otherwise. But an entire worldview only containing science without philosophy will only give you half the picture. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and Cosmos argues a materialist worldview will always lack explanatory power for fundamental things we believe exist. Now, even if he is wrong about some of his predictions, his basic point still holds true. Regardless of how many natural explanations we find, we'll never be able to naturally explain why there are natural explanations in the first place. The natural cannot explain the natural, because it is not infinite and exists contingently. Science cannot explain why there is science. Yet the natural order calls out for an explanation. Nagel says, systematic features of the natural world are not coincidences, and I do not believe that we can regard them as brute facts not requiring explanation. Regularities, patterns, and functional organization call out for an explanation. The more so, the more frequent they are. The logical mind seeks the most rational inference to explain the natural order, which is all these philosophical arguments are doing. So I implore atheists to keep this in mind when they are trying to respond to the arguments from natural theology. We theists are not arriving at our conclusion that God exists like one arrives at a scientific conclusion. We are instead reaching the most logical inference from the evidence we are presenting. Now, some might still have an issue with this and argue that since we cannot scientifically verify something outside the universe, we shouldn't make inferences about what constitutes the best explanation. So we should not draw any conclusion and just say we don't know for now. Well, this is fine to say, but if one says this, they have to accept the ramifications as well. In saying, "I don't know," you are also admitting you truly do not know and lack a position to argue from. Not only do you not know the best explanation, but you also do not know if the theist is correct. You cannot say you do not know, but know that it is wrong to infer a designer. In other words, pleading "I don't know" means you have no opinion on the evidence for either side and can't argue against the theist position, because by saying you don't have a clue, how do you know we theists are wrong to infer a designer? If you say this, then try to argue against the theist position, you are basically saying, "I don't know, but I know the theist is wrong," which refutes your claim that you don't know, because you wouldn't argue against theism if you didn't think there was knowledge we were wrong. So an "I don't know" plea means attempting to argue against theism is pointless, because if you don't know, then you cannot say theism is wrong, because to do so is a knowledge claim that we are incorrect. Also, if you're going to plead "I don't know," then you should also conclude you are ignorant on your own position, so you really don't know if it is right to say "I don't know," so this position becomes self-defeating. A different approach atheists will take is to assert the claim that extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence, which was made popular by Carl Sagan. However, this is a very vague claim. First of all, what does it mean to qualify as extraordinary? There is no scientific way to measure if something is extraordinary. Claiming something extraordinary is totally subjective. What is extraordinary for one person may not be the same for another.
What, you don't think this is amazing? When I saw this at the 1904 World's Fair, I nearly crapped my pants!
So why should atheists force their view of what is extraordinary on others? It is purely subjective, and therefore objectively meaningless. Ironically, many physicists say the degree of precision behind the fine-tuning of the universe is extraordinary. Roger Penrose says they are extraordinary figures. Paul Davies says the impression of design is overwhelming. So the atheist should not force his view of what qualifies as extraordinary on others as an objective claim. If that is the case, then perhaps the physicists studying the fine-tuning of the universe should do the same. But furthermore, if this is true, this is itself a claim, and wouldn't it be fair to say that a claim that establishes the validity of all other claims be extraordinary in itself? So saying extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence is an equally extraordinary claim. But the problem is there is no evidence for this. So this statement doesn't just lack extraordinary evidence, it lacks any evidence. Another attempt to dodge theistic arguments is to argue that future scientists will find natural explanations for the evidence we use to infer a designer. So essentially, they are relying on induction, that in the past, we have found natural explanations for phenomena that people used to attribute to God or gods. So the current evidence for God's existence will later in the future be explained by natural forces, and we do not need to invoke design. But the problem is this reasoning relies on the problem of induction. Claiming because we have found several natural explanations in the past doesn't deductively follow we can conclude there are natural explanations for these other things. Imagine we conclude a detective solved a crime because he has solved 100 prior cases. Each crime reaches a solution based on the evidence for that particular case. We do not conclude one is solved because 100 others were solved prior. Likewise, we do not conclude the philosophical inferences to a designer have natural explanations because science has found natural explanations to completely different things that once puzzled man. That is an absurd line of reasoning. Instead, we have to evaluate the evidence for that particular subject and reach the most rational inference as to what the evidence is suggesting. But furthermore, arguing scientists in the future will find natural explanations to evidence that points to a designer is essentially arguing for a god of the gaps. One is basically saying, well, I can't solve this, therefore smarter people will figure it out for us, and I don't need to worry about it. This kind of reasoning doesn't offer a conclusion, and it is simply an attempt to fill a hole with the unknown knowledge of future humans. With this line of reasoning, I could simply say the future scientists will find irrefutable proof that God exists, and who can really argue against that? So appealing to the future doesn't change the best evidence we have now. So trying to refute philosophical arguments doesn't work this way either. If atheists really want to refute theism, they have to either show that God is logically impossible, or offer a better inference than that of a personal designer. However, none of the atheist rebuttals to theistic arguments do this. Their main attempt is to try to discredit the possibility that a designer can be the explanation. However, since God is not an impossible concept, even if the atheist rebuttals were good, they cannot completely negate the possibility of a designer, and most importantly, they do not offer a more rational inference in place of a designer. So atheists can hammer away at the arguments from natural theology, but they still lack explanatory power for the evidence or a better inference. So still, the most logical conclusion we can draw is that of a designer, which makes me wonder, if no one can offer a better inference to the arguments from natural theology, what's wrong with deism? What is wrong with the inference that there is a deistic first cause? It is not forcing anyone to an actual religion or system of spiritual beliefs. It also doesn't entail belief in the afterlife, and it still leaves open the possibility that one could change his or her view if new evidence or theories are introduced. Of course, I would argue it is rational to go beyond deism, but that can be another subject. What is wrong with basic deism in taking the same route as Anthony flew?
I have followed my whole academic life on the principle that Plato scripted his Socrates to proclaim. We must follow the argument wherever it leads. And the result of following this principle eventually led me to something I didn't at all expect to be. But as it was the truth, I had to accept it. I was interested in truth.
When most theists argue from natural theology, we are not trying to trick atheists. We are simply following the evidence to where it leads and pointing out a designer is the most rational inference we can draw and is the best explanation. After that, we can have a discussion if any particular faith is correct. But we are not jumping to that point from just natural theology. All we are doing is drawing the most rational inference that there is a designer and implore others to think logically about the evidence as well.